Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to do one of my most requested videos, and that is a recommendation video all about horror audiobooks. I read quite a few horror books, but I actually read most of them physically. I do enjoy a lot of audiobooks, but I tend to read other genres, and that is mostly due to availability. My library does not invest a lot in purchasing audio versions of horror because it's not one of the most popular genres, but I have gotten more access due to using the subscription service Scribd, so I will put a little link and plug down below because I do have a link that gives you 60 free days if you want to try that out. It also helps me by getting me another free month. But back to the actual books, I think that audiobooks are a really good way to experience horror because so much of these books are about the atmosphere, about the setting, and you really get a good sense of place when you are listening to them, or at least if you're listening to an audiobook with a really good narrator. I am someone who's really particular when it comes to audiobook narrators. I always listen to a sample first, and if the audiobook narrator doesn't work for me, I will put down the book and get it from my library instead as an ebook or a physical book. But I want to share with you some horror books that I personally think are even better if you're able to try out the audiobook version. I really think the narrators enhance the reading experience, and hopefully there are some books on this list that you haven't heard of, or at least did not know that the audiobook version was so amazing. All that being said, let's get into the recommendations. First, I want to recommend a classic, and a lot of people say that audiobooks are a really good way to get into classics, and I somewhat disagree with that. Certainly there are exceptions like the one I'm about to mention, but for me, a lot of times classics are really about the prose, and I just don't feel like you really get to experience the author's writing or appreciate it the same way when you're listening to it. And I also find that a lot of classics are written in a more passive, third person, often a drier perspective than a lot of newer books. And so depending on the audiobook narrator, that can come across as a very dry performance. So I do tend to read more of my horror classics. However, the book that I want to talk about here is definitely worth checking out on audio. And that is I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, which is about the last man at the end of an apocalypse. He is the sole survivor and everyone else has been turned into these zombie-like vampires. And we get to see from his perspective. And the reason I want to recommend the audiobook narration is that I really felt like it added to the experience and the atmosphere. I actually read this one while biking around my city on my bike on this hot summer day. And you would think that with that setting that this book would not feel so scary, but I really got a sense of dread reading it. And that was because the author, or rather the narrator, did such a good job of creating this isolating situation where it just felt desolate and depressing. And I think it worked so well. You get this monologue, and from there, I just got such a personal connection to the main character and really became just absorbed in his story. So despite reading it in a setting that really should not have worked, this audiobook narration worked so well for me, and I highly recommend checking it out that way. I definitely think it enhances the story and is one of those classics that is really not even necessarily made better, because I think the classic is great in and of itself, but you really get a full experience of it through the audiobook narration. So definitely recommend this. Now I want to recommend World War Z, An Oral History by Max Brooke. This is a story that is set after a zombie apocalypse when humanity is rebuilding society. And as the title suggests, this is an oral history. So this is about a journalist that is going around the world getting various accounts of what happened to different nations, different people during this zombie plague, and then is putting it together in this book. And this book is told over multiple perspectives. It's a little bit older now, but at the time it was very revolutionary, or very exciting, at least in the audiobook industry, to have so many different audiobook narrators, including a lot of really famous actors, giving their voices to these different characters. I have heard that some of the accents don't necessarily ring true. A lot of the actors were putting on accents that weren't their own, so you don't necessarily get that really authentic experience. But at the time, I did really enjoy the audiobook. I thought that it really added to the story. This is one of those zombie books that's really not about the zombies, but instead you really get to see how the different nations reacted to the plague, and it's just very fascinating. And I think, again, this is one where I liked the book, but I liked it a lot more because I listened to the audiobook version. So if you're going to check it out, again, see if you can get a hold of the audiobook version. It just lends itself really well to the type of book that this is. Next, I want to recommend Broken Monsters by Lauren Beukes, which is a story of a female detective living in Detroit that is investigating these gruesome murders, where at the beginning of the story, a boy is found with his body partially attached to a deer. And from there are a series of more bodies that are found in similar ways. And so they start to see a crime pattern emerging. And so it's following the detective as she's going around trying to get clues and figure out who the culprit is. The story is told from multiple perspectives. So we also get to hear from her daughter, as well as a journalist who is following these gruesome crimes. From the synopsis, you probably think that this is actually a thriller, not a horror book, but I feel safe to say that no, this is a horror book. You need to go into this book knowing that is horror, because I've seen so many negative reviews where people thought they were getting a traditional classic thriller and then were really upset when the horror aspects of this book came into play. So just know that going in, that this is a book that sounds like a thriller but is actually something more. But the reason I want to recommend it on audio is the fact that as a thriller, I think it will appeal to people like myself that really enjoy reading thrillers on audio. I do think that the genre just lends well to the narration, and I think this one was just top notch. It has several narrators, which I really enjoy. So you get a male narrator for the male journalist and a female narrator for the main detective. And I just thought that there were a lot of quality voices that they included here. And it was just a very, again, immersive read, and definitely one to check out, especially, like I said, if you tend to read more thrillers on audio, but want to try some horror, this is a very good way to get started. Next, I want to recommend Ghost Radio by Leopoldo Gout. And this is probably one of the more underhyped horror books on this list, but it definitely has to be here because this is a story of a man who was born in Mexico, but as a young adult moved to America, where he now works as a radio broadcaster, and he has a show where he invites people on to talk about their experiences with ghosts. And this show was inspired by one that he heard as a child back in Mexico, and he wanted to recreate it for an American audience. And as you can probably guess, with the fact that it's all centered around radio broadcast, this works really well as an audio production. You get to have chapters where he is flashing back to his days in Mexico, but then you also get the present day interspersed with different people going into the show and providing their ghost experiences. So the fact that you are hearing it through your headphones is just perfect because you really get that audio production feeling. And it is one that you do want to try out the audiobook sample for yourself. It's narrated by an author that is of Latino descent, so I definitely appreciate the fact that you get that representation. But I'm going to say that the narrator has a very monotone voice, or at least puts on a very monotone voice for this book. And this is one that I actually tried and stopped reading once and decided to go back and revisit it. And I kind of had to push through the beginning, but once I got into the book, I really did enjoy it. So it's one that takes a little bit to get into. It's very meandering, very slow paced. But it's one that once you get immersed, you will not be able to stop reading. I got obsessed with this one. I had the wonderful opportunity to read part of this book while I was driving at night, and it was such an atmospheric, such a creepy experience to have this slow, monotone voice just talking to me, and it was just hypnotic. And this book has an incredible ending, so if you're going to read it all the way through. You definitely need to know where it ends, because while you're reading the book, you don't always know where it's going, but I really love this one. I feel it's very underhyped, and I highly recommend it for something different, something that must be experienced as an audiobook production. This is definitely one of those. If you're going to read it, get the audiobook. And next, I want to recommend The Haunted by Bentley. This, of course, is a very classic haunted house story about a family that move into a house that seems too good to be true. And of course, it probably is, because creepy things begin to happen and the family eventually begins to wonder if their house is haunted. This is one that I like to recommend on audiobook because it's a very contemporary haunted house story, which means that a lot of the things that the characters are doing in the book are things that you might also be doing while you're listening to the book. If you're like me, you do a lot of chores while you're listening, and so while I was doing laundry, the character in the book was also doing laundry, and then creepy things started to happen. And then there was another point where I was cleaning the bathroom mirror, and then suddenly the character was also looking in the bathroom mirror, and then creepy things started to happen. And those connections definitely made the book a little bit creepier. I do always need to mention with Bentley Little that his books are very weird, very sexualized, but I think that really adds to the audiobook experience because it's very uncomfortable to read at times. And I definitely found hearing the things described in the book very unsettling, and I definitely think that his books work very well in the audiobook form, so I personally recommend giving this one a try on audio if you have it available. Now, if you're willing to try some young adult horror, I would also recommend Dread Nation by Justina Ireland, and this is a story that is set after the events of the Civil War. However, they ended differently because a zombie plague broke out and changed the course of history. This story follows a young black girl who's being trained as a protectorate, so she goes to a special school where she learns how to fight zombies in order to protect white privileged young ladies. And this book works really well on audio because, as a lot of young adult books are, this one is very well produced. It has a very popular black narrator behind it who does a lot of young adult books that have female black protagonists, like The Hate You Give. So if you enjoy those really well-produced audiobooks, this is another one to check out. I really appreciate that you get an authentic black voice telling the story, and it's definitely an interesting one. Again, it's one of those zombie books that isn't really about the zombies, so go ahead, even if you're not a big fan of the subgenre. If you're willing to try a young adult book that definitely does not talk down to the reader, but really appeals to all ages and has a really diverse story to tell, I would definitely recommend this one. Finally, I want to talk about some Stephen King. Yes, he's more popular, but if you aren't aware, his books work really well on audio. I personally try to read all of his books that way because I have found a lot more success connecting to his stories. So really, I could blanket recommend him as an author, but I do want to point out two books here that I think have particularly strong audiobook narrators. The first one here is Pet Sematary by Stephen King, and this is definitely one of my personal favorites, and this book is narrated by the actor who plays Dexter on TV. I actually have not watched the TV show, so I don't have that personal connection, but even without that, I'll say that he gives a really good performance and definitely performs well in those really creepy moments. This, of course, is a story of a family that moved to a small town where there is a cemetery where people bury their pets. I'll leave the rest of the story there, but it's very much a close family story with a lot of strong emotional ties, but still a very creepy undertone to the story and a great climax. So I definitely recommend this one, especially if you are a fan of the Dexter TV show. You'll probably love this one even more. So I just absolutely recommend this one. It was one of those experiences where I was finding myself looking for excuses to read more of the audiobook because I just wanted to know what was happening next, and I just thought the narration was absolutely gripping and cannot recommend this one enough. And last, the other Stephen King book I want to talk about is The Institute, which is about a group of young children that have different psychic and telekinetic abilities, and they are stolen away in the night to go to an institute where there are a group of people that are performing experiments on them. This book is technically more of a sci-fi thriller than a horror book, but because it's Stephen King, I feel pretty safe to include it in this video anyway. And the reason I particularly want to highlight it is that if you're not aware, this is the same audiobook narrator who does You by Carolyn Kepnes, which I think is a really popular and well-known thriller book that has an amazing audiobook production. And so if you are someone like me that was obsessed with that audiobook and are looking for something with a similar tone, this book has that. Certainly, it's a different story. It's not that first-person serial killer that you get in You, but the audiobook narrator once again puts on an amazing performance, and it definitely added to my enjoyment of the book. It made for a very immersive read, very fast-paced. Again, that feeling of just not wanting to put the book down. So if you're going to try some Stephen King on audio, this is an excellent one to try out. It's one of his newer books, but there's a reason that it's gotten so much praise, and I thought it was a lot of fun, and yeah, just a brilliant production. So that's it for this video. I would love to hear down below if I helped you to find some new books to try out on audio. Hopefully you can find them available through your library or a service like Scribd. And I would love to hear your own recommendations for your favorite horror audiobooks. I really enjoy when I can find one with a really good production value. So I would love to hear your recommendations. I spend a lot of time on Audible just listening to different samples and trying them out and trying to figure out which ones are going to work for me. So recommendations are always appreciated. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know. I would love to do a part 2 with another round of books to talk about. If you aren't already, please consider subscribing. I read a lot of horror here, as well as some science fiction, thrillers, and fantasy. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Otherwise, I'll talk to you later. Okay, bye-bye.